I never believed in cursed objects until I inherited one that changed everything. My father gave me a World War II bayonet when I was just a kid, casually mentioning he'd found it wedged inside a car at the junkyard where he operated the crusher. He worked there for over 20 years, searching every vehicle before sending it to its metal grave, making sure nothing inside would explode or cause damage to the machinery. "Just a cool piece of history," he said, handing me the worn leather sheath containing what would become my greatest burden. The bayonet itself was authentic German steel, complete with its original handle and surprisingly sharp despite decades of neglect. Dark stains marked the blade near the hilt, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood that had been left to set permanently into the metal. For years, it sat on my bookshelf like any other collectible. I'd occasionally show it to friends, explaining its probable origins and marveling at its craftsmanship. The weight felt substantial in my hands, and there was something almost magnetic about the way light caught the blade's edge. I never thought much about why someone would abandon such a valuable piece of military history in a car destined for scrap. The first incident happened when I was 12. I'd been wearing the bayonet on my belt that morning, playing soldier in our backyard, when my mother called me in for lunch. As I sat at the kitchen table, still wearing the weapon like some kind of trophy, our family dog Max began acting strangely. He kept staring at me, or more specifically, at the bayonet hanging from my side, with an expression I'd never seen before, pure terror. Max was a golden retriever who'd never shown fear of anything, but he cowered in the corner, whimpering whenever I moved. That afternoon, while I was at school still wearing the bayonet, my mother found Max in his favorite sunny spot by the back door. He died peacefully in his sleep, she said, probably from old age, though he was only 7. I was devastated, of course. Max had been my constant companion, and his sudden death left a hole in our family that took months to heal. But I never connected his death to the bayonet. How could I? It was just a piece of metal, a historical artifact with no power over the living world. The second incident occurred 3 years later. My grandmother had been battling cancer for months, and while we all knew her time was limited, her death still came as a shock. I remember the phone call vividly because I'd just taken the bayonet to show a friend at school. We were studying World War II in history class, and I thought bringing an authentic piece would impress everyone. The call came during dinner that same evening. Grandmother had taken a sudden turn for the worse and passed away at the hospital, surrounded by family I hadn't been able to join because of a prior commitment. The guilt ate at me for weeks, but again, the timing seemed like mere coincidence. It wasn't until my grandfather's death 2 years later that the pattern began to emerge, though I still refused to acknowledge it. Grandfather had been in relatively good health for his age, taking daily walks and maintaining his garden with the dedication of a man half his age. I'd moved the bayonet to my car that week, planning to take it to a local military memorabilia show where I hoped to learn more about its history. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack while pruning his roses, the activity he loved most in the world. He died instantly, the paramedic said, probably feeling no pain. But I couldn't shake the image of him collapsing among his beloved flowers, alone, while I carried around what was beginning to feel like a harbinger of death. The final, undeniable proof came during a Memorial Day camping trip with friends. We'd driven up to the mountains for a long weekend of fishing and hiking, and I'd packed the bayonet almost as an afterthought, thinking it might make a good conversation piece around the campfire. It was buried deep in my duffel bag, forgotten until the tragedy struck. My best friend Jake was an experienced swimmer, having grown up near the ocean and spending most summers lifeguarding at the local beach. When our group decided to go river rafting, Jake volunteered to guide our raft through the more challenging rapids. The river was running higher than usual due to recent spring rains, but nothing that seemed particularly dangerous to our group of adventure-seeking teenagers. Everything was going perfectly until we hit an unexpected hydraulic current near a bend in the river. The raft flipped in seconds, throwing all of us into the churning water. Most of us managed to grab onto rocks or swimming to the calmer waters near the shore, but Jake got caught in the current. Despite his swimming expertise, the powerful flow dragged him underwater and held him there. We found his body 3 days later, nearly 5 miles downstream. The coroner said he'd probably hit his head on a submerged rock, causing him to lose consciousness before drowning. Another tragic accident, another coincidence that seemed to follow me wherever I carried that cursed piece of steel. It was while cleaning out my car after the funeral, trying to organize my thoughts and possessions in the wake of such devastating loss, that I discovered the bayonet had somehow fallen out of my bag during the trip. It was wedged between the car seat and center console, easily overlooked but undeniably present throughout our doomed camping expedition. That's when the pieces finally clicked together with horrifying clarity. Every death, every tragedy, every moment of loss in my life over the past 7 years had coincided with times when I'd had the bayonet in my possession. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, too precise to be mere coincidence. I drove straight home and found an old military surplus ammo can in our garage, the kind designed to keep moisture and contamination away from sensitive materials. I placed the bayonet inside, sealed it tight, and stored it in the darkest corner of our basement. That was 15 years ago, and I haven't touched it since. The death stopped immediately. No more sudden losses, no more tragic accidents befalling the people I loved. My remaining family members lived long, healthy lives, and new friendships weren't shadowed by the specter of inexplicable tragedy. But the knowledge of what that bayonet could do, what it had already done, never left me. I've researched its possible history, trying to understand how an ordinary military weapon could become such a vessel for death and misfortune. The stains on the blade suggest it saw combat, possibly taking lives in the brutal close-quarters fighting of World War II. Perhaps it absorbed some essence of the violence it participated in, becoming a conduit for the same destruction it once facilitated. Or maybe someone deliberately cursed it, using wartime desperation and ancient rituals to transform a tool of war into something far more sinister. I've read accounts of soldiers on both sides of the conflict turning to supernatural protection or revenge when conventional warfare wasn't enough. Whatever the explanation, I know I can never risk unleashing its power again. My children don't even know it exists, and I plan to keep it that way. Sometimes late at night when sleep won't come, I consider my options for permanent disposal. Throwing it into the same river where Jake died seems like poetic justice, though I worry about cursing some future finder who might pull it from the water. The bayonet sits in its metal tomb, waiting patiently in the darkness. Sometimes I imagine I can feel its presence even through the basement floor, a cold weight that presses against my consciousness like a physical thing. I tell myself it's just guilt and imagination, but deep down, I know better. Some objects carry more than history. They carry hunger, malevolence, and an inexplicable need to spread suffering to the living world. The bayonet my father found in that junkyard car was supposed to be destroyed decades ago, crushed into scrap and recycled into something harmless. Instead, it found its way into my life, bringing death and tragedy to everyone I loved. I can only pray that when my time comes, someone will have the wisdom to ensure this cursed relic finally meets the fate it was always meant to have. Until then, it waits, patient and deadly in its metal prison beneath my feet. There are some things in this world that seek you out when you're alone and vulnerable. And for me, those things came in the form of handwritten envelopes on empty train cars. What started as an unusual discovery became a pattern of supernatural terror that taught me some objects don't want to be found, they want to find you. It began during my university entrance exam period, one of the most stressful times in any Japanese student's life. The pressure was immense, with my entire future seemingly dependent on performing well in a series of tests that would determine which university would accept me. I'd been studying for months, surviving on minimal sleep and maximum anxiety. The day of my first exam, I took the subway alone to reach the testing center across the city. My mother had offered to accompany me, but I'd insisted on going solo, thinking the independence would help me feel more confident and adult. In retrospect, that decision may have saved her from experiencing what I was about to encounter. The train car I boarded was unusually empty for morning rush hour. Tokyo's subway system is notorious for its packed cars and cramped conditions, but this particular carriage held maybe 5 people scattered across dozens of seats. Something about the atmosphere felt off, too quiet, too sterile, like the metal walls were absorbing sound instead of reflecting it. That's when I noticed the envelope lying on the seat directly across from me. At first glance, it appeared to be ordinary lost property, maybe someone's exam documents or a personal letter that had fallen from their bag. The paper looked expensive, thick and creamy, with a slightly textured surface that suggested quality stationery. But as I looked closer, I could see that nearly every inch of the envelope's surface was covered in handwriting. Names, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, written in cramped but neat script that varied slightly in ink color and pen pressure. They looked like real people's names, full Japanese names with proper surname and given name combinations that felt authentic rather than random. The envelope wasn't sealed, and as I picked it up, I could feel something bundled inside shifting slightly with the movement. The weight and texture immediately triggered a visceral reaction I couldn't explain. Without even opening it to confirm my suspicions, the thought dropped into my head with absolute certainty. This was a cursed object, and the contents were human hair. My rational mind tried to dismiss this conclusion as stress-induced paranoia, but every instinct I possessed screamed at me to get rid of the envelope immediately. The moment I stepped off the subway at my destination, I went directly to a convenience store and bought a bag of salt, something I'd never done before, but which felt essential in that moment. I wrapped the envelope in a plastic bag and buried it completely in salt, following some half-remembered folklore about purification and protection. Then I disposed of the entire package in a public garbage area, reasoning that if it was just someone's lost property, they could retrieve it, but if it was something more sinister, at least it would be contained. The exam went well, and I thought that would be the end of it. Just a strange coincidence brought on by test anxiety and too much caffeine. But 3 months later, when I was traveling alone again for another university entrance exam, I saw a second envelope. This one was on a different train line in a different seat, but the recognition was immediate and undeniable. The handwriting was different, slightly more angular, with variations in character size that distinguished it from the first envelope, but the structure was identical. Names covering every available surface, the same expensive paper stock, and that distinctive weight that suggested hair bundled inside. The train car was again unusually empty, with only a handful of passengers who seemed to be deliberately avoiding looking at the envelope despite its prominent placement. I dealt with this second discovery the same way as the first, salt burial and immediate disposal, but now I was beginning to understand that this wasn't random coincidence. A week later, traveling to yet another exam at a different university, I found a third envelope. Same pattern, same eerie emptiness in the train car, same visceral reaction when I picked it up. But this time, I noticed additional details that made the experience even more disturbing. The envelope looked older than the previous two, with slight discoloration and a torn corner that revealed part of the contents inside. What I saw through that small tear confirmed my worst suspicions. Tightly bound human hair wrapped with strips of paper like a traditional curse talisman. The smell emanating from the envelope was foul and organic, like something that had been wet and rotting in a closed space for an extended period. The next day brought the most disturbing discovery yet. The fourth envelope appeared on my train route to what would be my final entrance exam, but this one was different in a way that made my blood run cold. It looked significantly older and more deteriorated than the others, and the tear in its side was large enough to reveal not just hair, but what appeared to be other organic materials wrapped within the bundle. The stench was overwhelming, a combination of decay, mildew, and something indefinably wrong that made my stomach turn. Other passengers seemed completely unaware of both the envelope and its smell, acting as though neither existed despite their obvious presence in the otherwise empty car. This time, I knew I needed more than just salt and disposal. I contacted a friend who lived in a house with a private yard and explained that I needed help destroying something that might be cursed. He thought I was being overly dramatic about what was probably just trash, but he agreed to help. We dug a pit in his backyard, placed the envelope inside, and covered it completely with salt before building a fire over the burial site. The smell that rose from the flames was indescribably awful, far worse than the envelope's original odor, and so intense it made our eyes water and our throats burn. We had to retreat several feet from the fire to avoid being overcome by the toxic fumes. When the flames died down and only ash remained, we gathered the residue and scattered it into a nearby river, following traditional purification practices neither of us fully understood but both felt were necessary. Before and after the burning ritual, we sprinkled ourselves with salt as additional protection against whatever malevolent force had been contained within that cursed package. Since that final burning ceremony, I've never encountered another hair-filled envelope on any train, regardless of how alone I might be traveling or how empty the car appears. The pattern that had been building over months of university testing broke completely, as though the destruction of that fourth envelope had somehow severed the connection between me and whatever force was placing them in my path. But the experience left me with questions that remain unanswered to this day. Who was creating these envelopes? Why were they being left specifically for me to find? What was the significance of the hair and the names written on each surface? Were they targeting me personally? Or was I simply the type of person who would notice and retrieve them when others would ignore such obvious supernatural warnings? The most disturbing aspect was how the train cars always emptied out when these envelopes appeared, as though other passengers instinctively knew to avoid those particular carriages. It suggested that whatever force was behind the envelope placement had influence over people's behavior, subtly directing them away from potential witnesses to ensure I would be alone when I made each discovery. I've researched traditional Japanese curse practices and found references to hair binding rituals used to target specific individuals or families. The names written on each envelope might have been previous victims or intended future targets, creating a network of supernatural malevolence that fed on itself with each new addition to the list. The fact that the envelopes appeared specifically during my university testing period when I was most vulnerable and isolated suggests they were designed to exploit periods of weakness and stress. Perhaps they were meant to influence my exam performance, or maybe they were building towards something even more sinister that the burning ritual prevented. Whatever their ultimate purpose, I learned that some objects actively seek out victims rather than waiting passively to be discovered. The hair-filled envelopes weren't random lost property. They were deliberate placements designed to ensnare someone like me who would be curious enough to investigate, but isolated enough to become a target. Now, years later, I still feel a chill whenever I board an empty train car. Part of me wonders if other cursed objects are still being placed for unsuspecting passengers to find, targeting people during their most vulnerable moments when they're traveling alone through the anonymous darkness of the subway system. Some objects choose their victims as carefully as predators select prey. And the handkerchief I discovered at that ancient temple in Saga Prefecture was one such calculating curse. What began as a peaceful solo trip to enjoy autumn foliage became a supernatural encounter that taught me objects can carry more than history. They can carry hungry malevolence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The temple I chose for my autumn excursion was locally famous for its spectacular seasonal displays. Breathtaking azaleas in spring and brilliant maple leaves in fall. Located deep in the quiet countryside of Saga Prefecture on Kyushu Island, it represented everything peaceful about rural Japan, far removed from the chaos and stress of university life. I'd been struggling with my studies and felt overwhelmed by the pressure of academic performance, social expectations, and an uncertain future. The idea of spending a day alone in nature, surrounded by the tranquil beauty of traditional Japanese architecture and carefully tended gardens, seemed like exactly what I needed to restore my mental balance. The drive took me through winding country roads lined with rice fields and small farming communities where time seemed to move at a gentler pace. Local residents had set up modest stalls along the roadside leading to the temple, selling homemade treats, fresh vegetables from their gardens, and handcrafted wooden items that reflected generations of artistic tradition. After parking in a small gravel lot near the temple entrance, I began the walk up the gentle sloping path that led to the main grounds. The atmosphere was perfectly peaceful, with elderly locals tending their stalls and greeting visitors with warm smiles and polite conversation about the weather and seasonal beauty. The temple's main staircase was an impressive sight, a long, steep series of stone steps climbing up the mountainside, flanked on both sides by carefully maintained azalea bushes that would be spectacular during spring blooming season. A sign indicated an alternative gentle path for those who preferred an easier ascent, but since this was my first visit, I decided to take the traditional front approach and climb the stairs properly. The physical challenge was more intense than I anticipated. My sedentary university lifestyle had left me in poor physical condition, and I was soon breathing heavily and feeling the burn in my leg muscles. About halfway up the staircase, I passed an elderly man who was taking his time, gripping the handrail for support and moving one careful step at a time. "You young people really do have it easy," he said with a kind smile as I passed him, pretending I wasn't already struggling with the climb. His friendly comment made me feel slightly embarrassed about my obvious lack of fitness, but also grateful for the human connection in what was otherwise a solitary experience. It was around this midpoint of the staircase that I noticed something out of place among the ancient stones and carefully maintained landscaping. A pale blue handkerchief lay folded on one of the upper steps, its delicate appearance contrasting sharply with the rough stone surface. The handkerchief was clearly expensive and well made, with intricate lace trim along its edges, and a quality of fabric that suggested it belonged to someone with refined tastes. It looked like the type of accessory a well-dressed elderly woman might carry, perhaps paired with a traditional parasol and formal kimono for special occasions. My first instinct was concerned for whoever had dropped it. If I left it on the steps, it might be stepped on, blown away by wind, or damaged by weather. The logical solution seemed to be retrieving it and bringing it to the temple office where lost items could be claimed by their rightful owners. Without thinking much about the decision, I bent down and picked up the handkerchief, folding it neatly and tucking it into my coat pocket before continuing up the stairs. The fabric felt expensive between my fingers, with a weight and texture that confirmed its quality, but there was also something else, a subtle coldness that seemed to radiate from the material itself. I climbed approximately 20 more steps before the first symptoms began. Despite the clear skies and warm autumn sunshine beating down on the mountainside, I was suddenly overwhelmed by a bone-deep chill that seemed to originate from inside my body rather than from external conditions. My initial thought was that the elevation change might have created a temperature difference, but as the cold sensation intensified rather than subsiding, I realized something far more serious was happening. My hands began shaking uncontrollably. Then my entire body started trembling as though I'd been plunged into ice water. The physical symptoms escalated rapidly. My breathing became labored and shallow, each breath requiring conscious effort as though my lungs were refusing to function properly. The sensation was terrifyingly familiar, exactly like the severe asthma attacks I'd suffered as a child, when my airways would constrict and leave me desperately gasping for air that wouldn't come. Panic set in as my vision began to blur and darkened around the edges. I dropped to my knees on the stone steps, bracing myself against the cold surface to prevent falling backward and tumbling down the steep staircase. My teeth chattered so violently I could hear the sound echoing inside my skull, and my fingertips had gone completely numb despite the warm weather. The attack continued to worsen, with my chest tightening as though being compressed by an invisible vice. I genuinely believed I was about to lose consciousness and possibly die on those ancient temple steps, far from any medical assistance or even cell phone coverage. Then, suddenly, a cheerful voice called out from behind me. "I finally caught up to you." It was the elderly man I'd passed earlier, breathing heavily from his climb, but smiling with friendly satisfaction at having completed the challenging ascent despite his age and physical limitations. The moment I heard his voice, every symptom vanished instantly. The crushing pressure in my chest disappeared, allowing me to take deep, satisfying breaths. The bone-deep cold evaporated as though it had never existed, replaced by the warm sunshine I should have been feeling all along. My shaking stopped, my vision cleared, and my hands regained their normal temperature and sensation. The sudden and complete reversal was almost more disturbing than the attack itself. Whatever had been affecting me was clearly not natural or medical. It was something that could be switched on and off like an electrical current, responding to factors that had nothing to do with my physical health or environmental conditions. Still shaken by the experience, I continued up the remaining steps more slowly, trying to process what had just happened while enjoying the increasingly spectacular autumn foliage that decorated the higher levels of the mountainside. By the time I reached the main temple hall, I'd almost convinced myself the entire episode had been a stress-induced panic attack, triggered by physical exertion and academic pressure. Standing before the main offering box, I pulled out my wallet to make a traditional monetary offering and express gratitude for safe travel. As I retrieved my wallet from my coat pocket, the blue handkerchief came out with it and dropped to the ground beside me. Bending down to pick it up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The handkerchief wasn't lying flat as it should have been. It was lumpy and irregular, as though something had been folded inside the fabric. When I began to carefully unfold it, small white pieces spilled out like confetti caught in the mountain breeze. Crouching down for a closer examination, I realized the white fragments were human fingernail clippings. Curved, jagged pieces that looked like they'd been trimmed with nail clippers and carefully collected rather than naturally shed. The discovery filled me with revulsion, but worse was yet to come. Continuing to unfold the handkerchief with trembling fingers, I found the main contents wrapped in the center of the fabric. It was an umbilical cord, damp, partially dried, and preserved with obvious intentionality. The organic smell that rose from it was nauseating, a combination of decay and something indefinably wrong that triggered an immediate physical reaction. Waves of nausea rolled through me as the full implications of the discovery sank in. This wasn't a lost handkerchief at all. It was a deliberately constructed curse object, designed with specific malevolent intent, and placed precisely where someone like me would find it. The fingernail clippings and umbilical cord were traditional components of powerful binding curses, used to establish spiritual connections between the curse creator and their intended victim. My hands were shaking as I hastily refolded the handkerchief to contain its horrific contents. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to get rid of the object, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever dark magic it represented. I placed it on the edge of the offering box,